need of a new engine, so Topham Hatt went to a workshop and saw all sorts of engines. At last, he saw a smart-looking green engine. What about this one? This is the Lionel G-Scale Percy, a custom Lionel model with a fully 3D printed body, a modified chassis, and a moving eye mechanism. He was constructed over a period of 5 months, and is, dare I say, the most ambitious project we've taken on. Yes, that's the one. Come along, Percy, there's no time to wait. I have an important job for you. Welcome back to another Lionel Model Showcase, and today I'm spotlighting my Lionel Percy. We're back here a lot sooner than I was expecting. Last we spoke, I had said I was going to work on some of my older models before I take on another big project. And that was the plan, but one thing led to another, and now I have a Lionel Percy. In terms of scope, this project blows all the others out of the water. None really compared to what went into making Percy. I was trying out different building techniques, experimenting with new tools and software. I can honestly say that no other model was built like Percy was, and that is something I'm very proud of. But telling you that Percy is different isn't really helpful, so it's about time that I showed you. Here's how I made the Lionel G-Scale Percy. I decided I'd be making Percy pretty soon after finishing Toby, and there were a couple of reasons for choosing him. For one, his name came up frequently in the comments of my videos, so he was obviously an engine you guys wanted to see. Percy is also one of the more popular characters in the show, being present from the beginning of the TV series all the way to All Engines Go. If Lionel continued their range, Percy would have likely been the next engine to get a model. Plus, adding Percy would complete the Farquhar branch line trio. But the biggest factor that went into picking Percy was my 3D printer. I knew that any engine I made would require a lot of 3D printed parts, even more so than my Lionel Toby. It's not really viable anymore to modify the bodies of these Thomas models. One, because of their limited supply, and two, because you can only modify them so much, so fully custom parts were required. The thing is, my printer is on the small side, being 220 by 220 millimeters, so trying to tackle the big engines like Gordon and Henry would just not be feasible without having to compromise on their designs. But Percy is roughly the same size as Thomas, and if I'm smart about how I split up the model, I should be able to print everything on my Ender 3. And so, with my mind made up, I started designing Percy. How Percy ends up looking mostly depends on the chassis I end up using. I considered using the chassis of Lionel's Thunder Mountain Loco since it was an 040, but decided against it as the wheelbase was too short for my liking. I ultimately decided to stick with modifying a Thomas chassis and purchased my 5th model soon after. When designing his model, I of course took inspiration from his original prop, but I also took a look at his Tomy Trackmaster toy and his O-scale Lionel model. Both companies took different approaches when designing their Percy, and I wanted to see what elements I could borrow from either. At this point, I was still under the impression I'd put Percy on the back burner. I figured I'd work on his model on and off for a couple of months while I focused on another project. But about a week in, I found myself being very productive and made this. A pretty rudimentary model of Percy, but not a bad one considering how quickly it was made. Out of curiosity, I decided to print out the parts and fit them to the chassis. And frankly, I was blown away with the results. This looked like Percy. Granted, it was gray, had 6 wheels, and was a little wonky in a few places, but it didn't look bad. It definitely made me feel like this project was entirely doable. And just like that, the Lionel Percy became my top priority. I quickly began refining the model, adjusting spacings, adding supports, and trying my best to replicate the Lionel style. I'd also print various prototypes to make sure that everything fit together and to the chassis. Speaking of the chassis, the donor Thomas I acquired was probably in the worst condition of any Thomas I had. It had no pickups or gears, so it was completely unable to move, it was missing various screws and a coupler, and much of the chassis had been removed. Apparently, the previous owner was using this for a project of their own, but abandoned it halfway through. This wasn't all bad, since I didn't need the body shell for this project, and the lack of gears actually worked in my favor, but I still needed to find solutions for everything else. After confirming the motor did work by swapping in pickups from another model, I went to the ever-reliable trains.com and bought this set of LGB sprung pickups. I was struggling to find the usual Lionel pickups, so I opted for these instead. LGB is basically the king of G-scale trains, so I trust that these will be quality. So after a quick installation and a rewiring for good measure, I had a working chassis, and now I could start preparing it for Percy. I started by removing a set of wheels to give it the correct configuration. The pre-existing slots in the chassis placed the wheels either too far away or too close to match Percy's. Fortunately, this gear slot was placed at the perfect spot in the chassis, and after drilling out the other side, the wheel fit nicely. This did leave me with a problem though. I couldn't drive the second wheel. Normally, Lionel models move thanks to the gears on their chassis. Unlike real engines, their side rods don't provide any tractive effort and are purely aesthetic. With how I position my wheels, I can't use gears to power them, causing a constant wheel slip. So how was I going to drive this second wheel? Well, the solution was actually simpler than I thought. I just used the side rods as side rods. By making Percy's side rods tighter than Thomas or James's, the first wheel will drive the second similar to how an actual steam engine would. Now I had to make Percy's iconic cylinders. As none of my previous customs had cylinders, I had no experience in making them, so I looked to the Gold Rush Special to see how they tackled them. In their case, the cylinder was a single piece that sat on the front of the chassis. It was fitted with a crosshead guided by rods and connected to a driving wheel. This was simple enough to understand, so I quickly began replicating it. Most everything was 3D printed apart from the crosshead, which comes from Lionel's Thunder Mountain logo. This setup did need some revising to make sure parts had proper clearance, but eventually everything worked out. And the last thing to rectify was the missing platform. This platform is where the running board and body connect to the chassis, so it's very much needed. Additionally, the previous owner had removed this pin for the coupler when cutting off the platform. Fixing it was simple enough. I just modeled and printed a replacement, then glued it in place. This then gave me the opportunity to add a coupler. With the chassis now done, I could return my focus to the body. I had mostly finalized the design at this point. Since the first iteration, the cabs received a tail lamp and a slot for the roof has been added. The leaf springs on the boiler had been modified and the front of the boiler had been adjusted to better fit the smoke box, which now slots into the running board. The running board now has guides so things easily slide into place, and a spot for the eye makers has been added. I also separated the sand boxes for ease of printing and added screw holes in post all over the model. I'd make some minor changes a little later, but this is essentially what Percy will look like. Now I can move on to printing the real thing. I knew from the beginning that I wanted to print Percy in colored filament as opposed to painting him. My experience with past models made me realize I don't really like the feel of paint. There's something about the texture it leaves that just bothers me, even when you add a gloss coat. There are of course parts that I can't avoid painting, but I was determined to have as much of this model be colored plastic. I actually tried out two different green filaments for his cabin boiler. First was this neon green from Elegoo, which when printed looked fine, but it was a bit too bright for my liking. So I then tried this classic green by Anycubic, which I thought looked so much better. It's not really show accurate, but most toys don't replicate his color exactly, so this is fine. The wheels were obviously not in the right color, and my initial plan was to paint them. But it's likely I wasn't going to get them in the right shade, so to make sure that Percy's color was uniform all over, I also took the liberty of recreating the wheels. Now with Lionel engines, changing the wheels can be quite difficult. My usual method is to use a vise to force the wheels apart, but I found you can use a soldering iron to heat the axle so that the wheels come loose. And after swapping the flanges and putting them back on the axle, I had a matching pair of green wheels. The running board was a bit tricky to get printed. The model is larger than my print bed, so I had to angle it to get it to fit. The bulk of the print looked fine, but the buffers always printed with some imperfections. I tested printing the models in two parts and welding them together, and the results were slightly better, but there was pretty obvious seam lines and the integrity was pretty questionable. I ultimately decided to print the buffers separate from the running board and weld them in place. With all parts now printed, I had to join them together. Wanting to be able to take the model apart if necessary, I bought this pack of threaded inserts to place all over the model. What I'd do is place the inserts on the screw post, and with my soldering iron I'd heat them up and let them sink into the plastic. I mainly used M3 sized inserts, but would switch to M2.5 for smaller holes. And with the inserts secured, everything was screwed together. So now I had to make Percy a face. Ordinarily, I would mold the face out of clay and cast it in plastic, but that wasn't going to work for Percy. There are a lot of intricate details that I wouldn't be able to properly translate with the clay, and if you're not particularly skilled, you could end up with a wonky face during the casting process. So I decided I would finally take the leap and 3D print a face. This is something I've always wanted to do, but was intimidated by the prospect of it. While I do have some experience 3D modeling, it's pretty rudimentary, and I've never tackled something as complex as this. Fortunately, I found this tutorial by Rexecutions on how they model Thomas faces, and this proved very helpful. So, I downloaded Blender and began my attempts to make Percy's face. As I tend to do with these models, I use the Tomy toys as reference for the face, as I want to imitate the inaccurate faces you tend to find in Thomas merchandise. It took me a couple of tries to get the hang of it, but eventually I got a face that I was happy with, and after tweaking it in 3ds Max, it was printed and attached to the model. I was really proud of myself for doing this. I had my doubts in the beginning, but it came out much better than I thought. I was so pleased with it, in fact, that I also made tired, angry, and shocked expressions. These are meant to slide onto the face of the model, just like the expressions that came with Thomas and James. So, at this point, Percy's model was complete. All that was left was to paint him up, and since he was mostly printed in color, this would be pretty simple. The plan was to also paint his dome, but during testing I found I didn't like the look of the paint markers or the acrylic, so I opted to reprint the boiler without the dome and print it separately with yellow filament. I then hit everything with a clear coat before cutting out the decals for his portholes and numbers and applied them to the model. The Lionel Percy was complete. After a couple weeks of shunting in the yard, the Fat Controller came to see Percy. Percy, you've done good work. As a reward, I'm assigning you the mail train. Now, it wouldn't be a Lionel showcase video if I didn't also debut new pieces of rolling stock, and I have what are probably my favorite pieces that I've made so far. The Sodor mail van and brake van. It was really a no-brainer choosing Percy's rolling stock. Percy is most commonly associated with a mail train, so it just made sense. These are both completely made from scratch, with the only reused parts being their wheels. I carefully studied Lionel's rolling stock to see what design elements I can incorporate into mine, and this was the result. The brake van was pretty simple in terms of design, not having many details outside the windows and ducats. It's actually quite similar to Annie and Clarabelle, having a van that fits over the running board and being designed to work with their trucks. The mail van is wholly unique, having a one-of-a-kind running board that dips in the middle. The van is extremely detailed, featuring many of the ducts, windows, and wood paneling present on the original. Now, designing them was the easy part. Getting them printed was a whole nother story. I spent countless hours trying to get models that looked halfway decent. I'd attempt a print and it'd either fail halfway through or it'd finish with some defects. This was so frustrating, as these models can take at least 10 hours to print and half a day's work can be wasted just like that. It was a constant game of tweaking the settings and hoping everything works. But after several rounds of printing, I finally got models that I was happy with. While I was able to print the brake van's parts in one piece, the mail van was far too large for the print bed. So what I ended up having to do was split the entire model in half, print out both sides, and weld them together. Initially, the mail van was printed in the same red filament I used for Percy's running board, and with how many times I had to reprint it, I almost left it this way. But wanting this to be an accurate representation of the mail van, I knew I had to change the color. So I spray painted a darker red, which did look fine, but remembering my feelings on painting models, I bit the bullet and reprinted the van in E-Sun's fire engine red, and this looked so much better. I then assembled the model and began decorating. painting the frames black, shooting it with a clear coat, and applying the soda or mail lettering to the doors. The brake van didn't require nearly as much decoration. I gave it a coat of gray to cover all the sanding, and that was it. And with that finished, Percy now had his iconic mail train. So, after 5 months of work, the Lionel Percy is complete, and it looks amazing. But I've got one more surprise. To really sell that this is a Lionel product, I designed Percy custom packaging. I carefully examined Thomas and James's boxes and tried my best to replicate the style in Photoshop. I recreated all the boxes and put pictures in them, added text blurbs and logos, even threw in the as seen on Shining Time symbol for good measure. I then printed out the art, glued it to a cardboard sheet, then cut and folded it accordingly. I bought a spare Thomas box to use the styrofoam from, cutting bits out to make the models fit, and once that was done, everything was placed inside and covered with my custom lid. Now I had a fitting place to store the models. But I didn't just make the packaging, I also designed a bunch of accessories. Included in the Percy set are a posable signal that can be moved to the danger or clear positions, a coal bunker with a removable coal load, and a set of buffers to be placed at the end of the track. And to keep them in style with the pre-existing accessories, I printed them in bright garish colors. The last thing I have to show off is this custom sound remote. The Deluxe Thomas set came with this remote that played 6 different sound effects. Mine unfortunately doesn't work, but I thought it'd be cool if other engines got remotes like it. I accomplished this by taking an Adafruit board, loading it with sound effects, wiring it to a custom PCB, and fitting it in a 3D printed shell.
Well done. You're a really useful engine.
Apart from Percy's theme, all the sound effects are the same as Thomas's, but I think it'd be pretty cool if each engine had unique sounds. So tell me what sounds you think I should add. This project has been an exciting one, and I'm really impressed by what I was able to accomplish. 3D printing was certainly the way to go with this project, as Percy is undoubtedly the best looking model in my collection. And the best part is, it's something that I made all on my own. And if you feel like making a Lionel Percy yourself, all the files will be available in the description, including the accessories, decals, and everything for the sound remote. All free to use and or modify. I'll now leave you with clips of Percy running on a full-size layout. Not far from me is the Gibsonville Garden Railway, a volunteer-run layout that lets you bring your own trains to run. I brought Percy down when he was finished and had a great time running him, so if you're ever near the Gibsonville area, I'd definitely check it out. So, what's next? Well, since I have most of the famous 8, I'll likely get around to making Lionel versions of Henry, Gordon, and Duck. This probably won't happen for a while though. With the potential size of these models, I'd like to upgrade my printer to something a bit bigger and with more precision. I've basically been pushing my printer to the limit with this project, having to perform some kind of repair on it every couple of weeks. So yeah, a new printer is definitely needed before I even consider doing any of them. In the meantime, I have a couple projects that I'll be working on. I do still plan on making improvements to some of my older models. In fact, I've already made some progress. The Lionel Edwards received new side rods and a front bogey, as well as a much cleaner looking face. I'd like to redo his paint job, although I may just print him a new boiler with blue filament and correct the firebox while I'm at it. Ordnance, Thomas, and James are due for a new coat of paint, and I'd like to replace Thomas's lettering with stickers cut from my Cricket. I've also got big plans for my radio-controlled Thomas. I'm basically going to revise his aesthetic and completely redo his electronics, but more on that when I start making progress. Outside of the improvements, I'd also like to recreate the Lionel, Thomas, and James. I noticed that most Lionel models you find are either missing parts or are damaged in some way. And while you may be able to find spare parts from a secondhand seller, they usually have a limited supply. That's why I want to recreate these models piece by piece so that they are resources for repairing these engines. Ideally, you'd be able to reconstruct the models entirely from 3D printed parts. I don't know when I'll have this project finished, but I plan to have the files publicly available for anyone to use. I'm also planning on selling parts for people who don't have access to a 3D printer. I'll post on Instagram and the community tab when I have more information on that. And lastly, I want to plug one more thing. At the beginning of this year, I started a Patreon to help fund my various projects, and judging by the scale of this one, it's definitely needed. For $5 a month, you can get previews of upcoming videos, early access to finished videos several days in advance, and updates for all the projects I'm currently working on. Those update shorts I've been making, the patrons have been getting those a whole month before YouTube does, along with various other update posts and videos. So join now to get the latest updates on the projects I've mentioned and more. The next video coming to the channel is one cataloging as many Dad with Thomas replicas as I can find, and I should have some update on that coming soon. Patreon is the best way to support me doing what I'm doing. I have lots of big plans in the works, and having that extra financial boost would really help make these projects better and faster. And even if you don't join, just watching and sharing my videos goes a long way to support me too. Anyway, this is where I'll end the video for today. I hope you guys enjoy it, and I thank you for watching. Alright guys, bye.